Hello, I'm Phil Passen. This is a hammered dulcimer. This program is March of the Women, music to commemorate 100 years of suffrage. Before I get started, I'm going to take just a minute to tell you about the hammered dulcimer. Many of you are probably familiar with a much smaller instrument called a dulcimer. It's tear-glass shaped or hourglass or teardrop shaped. It's usually played on the lap. It's got 3 or 4, sometimes 5 strings. It's fretted and strummed or plucked. That was developed in the Appalachians in the 1800s in this country, early 1800s, probably derived from a German instrument. This is a hammered dulcimer, which most likely developed in Persia, what's now Iran, over 1,000 years ago. Probably came into Europe with returning crusaders in the 12 and 1300s. Was very popular in Europe, especially in the 1600s in the court of King James. From Europe spread to many parts of the world, not all over the world, but many parts of the world. It came to this continent. It's been documented on this continent since 1733. The hammered dulcimer is the direct ancestor of the piano. You can see that it looks just like the inside of a piano. It's a little simpler, but these are just piano wires strung over wooden bridges. In Europe, when the dulcimer was popular in the 1600s, the keyboard instrument was a harpsichord, which, as you know, looks like a small piano. But when you hit a key on a harpsichord, there's a pick inside that, whoops, that plucks or doesn't pluck. And if it plucks, you either get louds or softs. You really can't get dynamics. Whereas with a struck instrument, obviously, you can, by varying the strength of the strike, you can vary the volume. So the harpsichord builders and players liked the idea of a struck instrument. They took these, put keyboards on them. The first ones were like 8 feet long. They attached hammers in the right places, so if when you hit a key, it would come down and hit the right note. Put a little quick release mechanism on them, and so instead of going like that, it went like that. Got a nice clean sound. Downsized them to the pianoforte, which means soft and loud, and to the modern piano. And of course, you know that when you hit a key on a piano, a hammer comes in down and strikes a string. No keyboard here. I'm doing the hammering, and it's just like this. All of which has nothing to do with women's suffrage, except that upstate New York, for some reason, has long been a hotbed of hammered dulcimer activity. Before the Civil War, there were a couple of hammered dulcimer factories there, and since then, that area has produced lots of great dulcimer players. There are dulcimer festivals, and upstate New York, as I'll discuss in a few minutes, was the launching pad for the women's suffrage movement, Seneca Falls. And many of the early suffrage leaders lived in upstate New York, and I would be pretty confident to bet that many of them knew about the hammered dulcimer, had seen or heard a hammered dulcimer, and maybe even knew someone who played one. I'm going to be doing songs from the women's suffrage movement, the movement to win the right to vote for women, from the late 1800s through the early 1900s, with a few songs that are from later than that deal with issues that women were fighting about then, during the suffrage movement, and continue to fight about today. I've been down to Madison to see the folks and sights. You'd laugh, I'm sure, to hear them talk about women's rights. For it's just as plain as my old hat, as plain can be. But if the women want the vote, they'll get no help from me. Not from Joe, not from Joe. If he knows it, not from Joseph. No, not from Joe, not from me. I tell you no. Say, friend Joseph, why not we should vote the same as you? Are there no problems in this state that need our wisdom too? We must pay our taxes, same as you, as citizens be true. And if some wicked thing we do, we're sent to jail by you. Yes, we are, same as you. And you know it, don't you, Joseph? Yet you do, yet you boast. You will not help us win the vote. Say, dear women, don't you see the home is your true sphere? Just think of going to the polls perhaps 2 times a year. You are wasting time you want to spend in sewing or in work. Your home neglected all those hours we do such duties sure. Help from Joe, help from Joe. If he knows it, not from Joseph. No, not from Joe, not from me, I tell you no. Joseph, tell us something new, we're tired of that old song. We'll sew the hems and cook the meals, to vote won't take us long. We'll help clean house, the one too large for man to clean alone. The state and nation, don't you see, when we the vote have won. Yes, we will, and you'll help, for you'll need our help, friend Joseph. Yes, you will, when we're in, so you better help us win. You're just right, how blind I've been, I've never seen it thus. 'Tis true the taxes you must pay without a word or fuss. You are subject to the laws men made, and yet no word or note may you sing out where it counts. I'll help you win the vote. Yes, I will. Thank you, Joe. And together we'll be voters. Yes, we will. If you'll all vote yes at the polls next fall. In 1648, Margaret Brent went before the Maryland Provisional Assembly and demanded the right to speak and to vote in the assembly. And she was refused on the grounds that the only women who could be granted such rights were queens. And for over 250 years after that, women in what became the United States fought for the right to vote, for suffrage, as well as for equal rights for women. And of course, we're still fighting for equal rights for women. In 1848, 200 years after Margaret Brent made her stand, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton convened the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls in upstate New York. And that launched the struggle for women's suffrage. It also launched what's called the first wave of feminism. Just a few years later, in Worcester, Massachusetts, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held. In 1866, the first major national organization to fight for suffrage was formed. That was the American Equal Rights Association. It was founded by people like Frances Watkins Harper, the very important African-American suffrage leader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison. The organization only lasted for a few years till it broke up, but what they fought for was universal suffrage. They fought for the right to vote for African-American men and for all women. In 1869, Wyoming became the first territory or state in which women won full suffrage, that is, the right to vote in all elections, including presidential elections. By the mid-1890s, the two leading organizations in the fight for suffrage were the National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and later Carrie Chapman Catt, and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was founded in 1896 by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, Mary Church Terrell, among other African-American suffrage leaders, because by that time the racism, the institutionalized racism, which so gripped the country and really took hold, especially after the defeat of Reconstruction, was so great that the mostly middle-class white suffrage organizations did not allow African-American women to join. And African-American women had been in the forefront of the struggle for suffrage, so they formed their own local and national organizations. And those two organizations, along with others, for decades carried out mass leafleting campaigns, national speaking tours, mass marches. The first Women's March on Washington was a march for suffrage in 1913. 8,000 women marched. The march was broken up by cops and mobs who threw rocks at the women, chased them, caught them, beat them. But just a couple years later in New York City, there was a march of 45,000 people for suffrage. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin from Montana became the first woman elected to the U.S. Congress. In 1917, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, which she founded and led, called for picketing in favor of suffrage in front of the White House. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands, really, of women participated. Many were arrested. They were taken to jails. They were taken to prison. They were, many of them were brutally beaten by prison guards. Some were violently force-fed when they tried to go on hunger strike. And the public outrage at the brutality with which those women were treated was one of the driving factors in the last push for suffrage. And in June of 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, which prohibits the federal government or states from denying the right to vote on the basis of sex. The first three states, by the way, to ratify the 19th Amendment within days were Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In August of 1920, Tennessee became the 36th and final necessary state for ratification to ratify the amendment, and it became law on August 26th of 1920. And you know, even after a constitutional amendment is ratified or dropped, state legislatures can still continue to vote on it. And the last state legislature, the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment was Mississippi in 1984. The song I sang was copywritten in 1912 by Mrs. A.B. Smith. It was published by the Busy World Publishing Company from Madison, Wisconsin. It was one of the most popular songs sung at suffrage events. It dealt with one of the main tactics used by suffrage activists, and that was to argue with, discuss with, convince, persuade men, because men had the vote, and it was men who had to be won over for women to win the right to vote. This next song is in that same vein of discussion with men. This song I've read was the most popular song at suffrage events, most likely because it's done to a melody that was very well known then as now. That is the melody that was used for Robert Burns's Auld Lang Syne. This song was copywritten in 1883 by D.A. Estabrook. sincere. Her rights are just the same as mine. Let woman choose her sphere. Her rights are just the same as mine. Let woman choose her sphere. The verse about the man who squandered his cash on drink and starved his wife at home reflects the connection between the suffrage movement and the temperance movement. Alcoholism was a terrible problem then, as it is now, but then there weren't all of the organizational and community and educational, legal, spiritual means of intervening in the problem to help alleviate it, both on an individual and a societal basis. And women had it very, very rough. Men did go out and squander the family resources on drink and would come home and oftentimes be verbally and physically abusive and violent to their wives. And women had no recourse. Because of property laws, women really could not sue for divorce. Men could sue for divorce, women could not. They couldn't leave their husbands because that would have been societally frowned upon no matter what the reason. And there were very few jobs for women, no social support system. So most women just felt, well, the only way to deal with this problem is to outlaw drinking altogether. And participating in the temperance movement gave tens of thousands of women the opportunity to discuss and argue all kinds of topics with men. And historians feel that that interaction between women and men in the temperance movement was a real important factor in convincing enough men to vote for women to win the right to vote. The other movement, of course, that women from the suffrage movement were very active in was the abolitionist movement. Most, if not all, of the early suffrage leaders were activists in the abolitionist movement. Frances Watkins Harper, Sarah Parker Remond, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Julia Ward Howe, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, and many, many other women who were activists in the suffrage movement were activists in the abolitionist movement. And participating in the abolitionist movement gave women great experience as writers, speakers, organizers, but they encountered horrible sexism in the movement. Women were not allowed to join most abolitionist organizations. They weren't allowed to speak at meetings of organizations, even if they were members. In most cases, they were not allowed to publicly represent abolitionist organizations when they gave public speeches in favor of abolition. And it was that sexism that convinced thousands of women of the need for a separate women's movement. In 1848, at Seneca Falls, by the way, the suffrage resolution was only one of 11 resolutions passed at the convention. The others dealt with other aspects of women's rights. The need, for example, for a woman to be able to sue for divorce. The need for a woman to be able to sign a legal contract. Women could not legally sign contracts. The need for a woman to be able to own and control her own property. When a woman got married, she essentially became the property of her husband. And any property that she had when she got married or that came to her after she was married automatically was transferred to her husband's name. She had nothing to do with it. She had no say about it. It became his to do with as he wanted forever. And those laws, by the way, on the property aspect were not changed in this country until the 1920s. The suffrage resolution at Seneca Falls was the only one of the 11 resolutions that did not pass unanimously. Women were very concerned with the ridicule and scorn and the physical violence that would be directed at them if they began to organize for suffrage. And they were right to be concerned about those things. The press, of course, treated them with horrible mockery and ridicule. Having mud deliberately thrown or splashed on them at street corners was pretty much the mildest physical abuse that they took. Suffrage activists had rocks thrown at them. They had people, mobs and cops and individuals chase them, beat them. They were thrown into jail. They were institutionalized in psychiatric institutions. They were thrown also into prisons. It was a very, very difficult, and sometimes it was a brave and dangerous thing to do, to be a suffrage activist. And the suffrage resolution at Seneca Falls passed by a very narrow margin, mainly on the basis of an impassioned speech given in its behalf by one of the few men at the convention, and that was Frederick Douglass. In 1869, there was a split in the suffrage movement and between a section of the suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement when Frederick Douglass and other male abolitionist leaders decided to table the struggle for women's suffrage and to concentrate all their efforts on getting the 15th Amendment ratified. The 15th Amendment was the amendment by which African American men won the right to vote. Because the abolitionist leaders felt if they combined the two issues, they probably wouldn't get either. And they may well have been right because of the tremendous opposition to women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, among others, were furious at this. They felt that if women didn't get the right to vote then, they'd never get it. They broke relations with Douglass. They had actually, especially Susan B. Anthony, had been very, very close friends with Frederick Douglass. That friendship resumed later in life, but for now it was broken. And Stanton and Anthony and some other women formed a new organization out of the American Equal Rights Association, a new organization called the National Women's Suffrage Association. And they campaigned actively against the 15th Amendment, against the right of African American men to vote. They allied with racists and used racist arguments to do so. And they continued to campaign nationally for women's suffrage. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Frances Watkins Harper, Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, William Lloyd Garrison formed another organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association. They campaigned actively nationally for the 15th Amendment, for the right of African American men to vote. They stopped campaigning nationally for women's suffrage because they didn't want to combine the two issues, but they continued to campaign actively and aggressively on a state-by-state basis for women's suffrage. And in 1870, by the way, after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, Frederick Douglass resumed active campaigning for women's suffrage. Among the speakers who were popular speakers for both suffrage and abolition, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth were the most popular. And in 1851, Sojourner Truth gave an extemporaneous, off-the-cuff speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, which several years later was transcribed from notes and memory by one of the women who chaired the convention, and that transcription has become known as Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech. This musical setting for it was done by the folk singer Kristen Lems. So this is Sojourner Truth's 1851 speech, Ain't I a Woman. That man over there, say a woman, needs to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helped me into carriages or over mud puddles or gave me a best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 5 children and seen most all sold into to slavery. And when I cried out a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? That little man over there, say a woman can't have as much rights as a man, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. In 1845, Lucy Stone, who went on to become a very important suffrage leader, was a student at Oberlin College in Ohio, and to help earn part of her tuition, she took a job student teaching arithmetic in the ladies department of the college, as it was called, and for that she was paid half of what male students were paid for doing the exact same kind of student teaching. And she protested, went to the faculty board, and demanded that she be paid the same salary that men were paid for doing the same work, and the faculty board refused, and Lucy Stone went on strike. Her students overwhelmingly supported her. They actually offered to pay her tuition, which she graciously declined. She stayed on strike for 3 months, and she won her strike. The faculty board agreed to pay her and all the women doing student teaching the same salary that men got for doing the same work. Today, the average earnings of women are about 78% of that of men, and that doesn't even include all of the unpaid work that women do at home. In 1981, when Fred Small wrote this song, the average pay of women was about 59% of that of men. High school daydreams come easy and free when you're a working woman. What you're gonna be, a senator, a surgeon, aim for the heights, but the guidance office says lower your sights to 59 cents for every man's dollar, 59 cents. It's a low-down deal. 59 cents makes a grown woman holler. They give you a diploma, it's your paycheck they steal. She's off to college, the elite kind, to polish her manners and sharpen her mind. Honors in English, letter in lacrosse, types her to type for her favorite boss at 59 cents for every man's dollar, 59 cents. It's a low-down deal. 59 cents makes a grown woman holler. They give you a degree, it's your paycheck they steal. Junior executive on her way up, special assistant to the man at the top. She's one in a million, and what has she found? Her own secretary to order around at 59 cents for every man's dollar, 59 cents. It's a low-down deal. 59 cents makes a grown woman holler. They give you a title, it's your paycheck they steal. The words being processed in the typing pool. A working woman ain't nobody's fool. She's telling the boss on Secretary's Day, keep your flowers, buddy, give us a raise to more than 59 cents for every man's dollar, 59 cents. The deal has changed. 59 cents makes a grown woman holler. You can keep your flowers, buddy, give us a raise. 59 cents for every man's dollar, 59 cents. The deal has changed. 59 cents makes a grown woman holler. You can keep your flowers, buddy, give us a raise. with all of the opposition to women's suffrage, there were anti-woman suffrage songs. This is the one that was the most widely sung. It was written in 1895 by a man named Winthrop Packard, and he used many of the insults, or what were intended to be insults, that were thrown at suffrage activists, that they really wanted to be men, that they looked a fright, they were a fright, that they belonged in asylums, they were crazy. In 1849, a natural health care journal called The Water Cure had begun to advocate for women to stop wearing corsets and to stop wearing the long, heavy skirts they were expected to wear, and to start wearing shorter skirts and to start participating in physical activities. Tens of thousands of women took that advice, and many started to wear shorter skirts that had separated legs, like pants. And in 1851, the well-known temperance and suffrage leader Amelia Bloomer declared that she was going to start wearing those shorter skirts with separated legs, and called on all women to join her in doing so. And so those separated skirts or those shorter skirts with separated legs became associated with Amelia Bloomer and became called bloomers. Men hated the idea of women wearing pants because, in the words of the day, men wearing pants usurped male authority. They also hated the fact that women wearing pants, yeah, did I say that? Women wearing pants usurped male authority. Men didn't like that. They also hated the fact that women wearing pants could now participate in physical activities that had previously been reserved for men, like riding a bicycle. So here's the 1895 anti-suffrage song, Eliza Jane. Eliza Jane, she had a wheel, its rim was painted red. Eliza had another wheel that turned inside her head. She put the two together and gave them both a whirl, and now she rides the parkway sides, a 20th century girl. No more do skirts enfold her, oh much her papa grieves, but baggy trousers hold her in their big pneumatic sleeves. For where you see the bloomers bloom, she sits her wheel astride. She makes a sight, would stop a fight, as through the park she rides. Oh, have you seen Eliza Jane cycling in the park? Have you seen Eliza Jane? The people all remark. They shout hi hi as she rides by, the little doggies bark. Well, we all love a pain when Eliza Jane goes cycling in the park. It is Emancipation Year, the woman's movement's on. Eliza plans to be a man, too sad to think upon. She thinks she needs the ballot now, her freedom to enhance. She wants to pose in Papa's clothes, it is for this she pants. Eliza had a nice young man, the last was long ago, as gay and fair and debonair as any man you know. He saw her ride in bloomers, he screamed and quickly fled, and as he ran, this nice young man in trembling accent said, oh, have you seen Eliza Jane cycling in the park? Have you seen Eliza Jane? The people all remark. They shout hi hi as she rides by, and the little doggies bark. Well, we all love a pain when Eliza Jane goes cycling in the park. Eliza's brothers saw her ride, and each one turned to drink. They made it flow to drown their woes, so that they need not think. But there are woes that will not drown, not even in a well. And in the worst of their great thirst, Eliza heard them yell. Have you seen Eliza Jane cycling in the park? Have you seen Eliza Jane? The people all remark. They shout hi hi as she rides by, the little doggies bark. For we all have a pain when Eliza Jane goes cycling in the park. Eliza, dear, we sadly feel you have not started right. You will not see more liberty by being such a fright. Asylums run for you, my dear, and in the books we read that bloomers that too early bloom soon fade and go to seed. No more upon her red wheel the fair Eliza where she rides the parkway sides in bifurcated skirts. A park policeman ran her in one day in early spring because he thought Eliza taught the new birds to sing. Oh, have you seen Eliza Jane a-cycling in the park? Have you seen Eliza Jane? The people all remark. They shout hi as she rides by and the little doggies bark. Throwing all the pain, Eliza Jane goes cycling in the park. The suffrage movement was an international movement. When it was going on in the United States, there was a mass women's movement in Germany. In Russia, it was a mass march of tens of thousands of women on International Women's Day in 1917 in Petrograd. That started the events that led to the Russian Revolution. There were mass women's movements at the time in Chile, Switzerland, Turkey, Mexico, Japan, Australia. In Australia, women in the suffrage movement won their first major victory in 1894 when women in the state of South Australia won full suffrage. And in 1994, there was a 100-year commemoration of that event. And as part of that, or inspired by that, the Australian folk singer Judy Small wrote this song. Did she leave home that morning with a song in her heart? Did she walk or take the tram or drive her own horse and cart? Did she march up to that town hall without fear or shame? And can anybody tell me now what was her name? What was her name? Tell me what was her name? That woman striding off to the ballot box to claim the right to make her mark and set the world aflame. She's a sister of mine. Tell me what was her name? Was she a real lady in her bombazine and furs? Was the hard life of a miner's wife hers? Once you're in that In the 1960s and 1970s, there were great mass social movements around the world. In the United States, of course, there was the women's liberation movement, which is called the second wave, or launched the second wave of feminism. There was the civil rights movement, the movement against the war in Vietnam, the gay liberation movement. And as is almost always the case with such mass social movements, the ruling class, the powers that be, meet those movements first with brutal and deadly force and violence. And then, as the movements grow larger and aren't turned back by that force and violence, the ruling class makes concessions, usually in the form of legislation, really in order to dampen the movement and satisfy it and dissipate it, make it go away. And even though those pieces of legislation are concessions designed to really turn the movement back, they're nevertheless usually very hard-fought, hard-won, and important victories. In 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Movement won great victories with the 25th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act, which combined to prohibit states from denying the right to vote to large sections of the population, specifically African Americans, by using such tactics as requiring ID cards, having residency requirements, literacy tests, poll taxes, and by prohibiting states from doing these things, those pieces of legislation opened up the actual opportunity to vote, not just the legal right, which people already theoretically had, but the actual opportunity to vote to millions of Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, large sections of the white sections of the working class, especially the lower income sections of the working class. And of course, with those sections of the working class, with those sections of the population, all the women who were part of that population, who had supposedly won the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, but had been denied the right to vote along with the rest of their class or their social category or ethnic grouping. In 1972, the women's liberation movement won a great victory when, as part of the educational amendments passed by Congress, Congress passed Title IX. Title IX prohibits any educational institution which receives federal funding, and that's most educational institutions, from discriminating in any way on the basis of sex. We usually think of Title IX as affecting women's collegiate sports, but actually Title IX applies to all the whole realm of education and academia. Title IX applies to hiring and firing, both of teaching staff and administrative staff, to tenure, the granting of tenure, to curriculum, to what's taught, to clubs and organizations on campus, to research grants and fellowships. Title IX has opened up tremendous opportunities for millions and millions of girls and women. It's been very, very important. And of course, these social movements also affect the culture around us. Movies, radio, music, TV, all reflect what's going on. And a little bitty example of that, maybe not so little bitty, but an example of that was a television program that ran on ABC TV in the Saturday morning children's programming block. It ran, I think it started in the early or mid-70s, 1970s, and ran through the 80s. I think it's actually been revived a couple times. It's just a 3-minute animated show with a song that runs between other programming, and it was Schoolhouse Rock. Schoolhouse Rock dealt with all kinds of school subjects, of course, but also did a lot of social and political topics, and in many cases tried to teach kids the history of what was going on around them. And in 1976, in June of 1976, in the midst of the struggle to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, the Schoolhouse Rock ran this song on a segment called Sufferin' Without Suffrage. you've heard of women's rights and how we've tried to reach new heights. And if we're all created equal, well, that's us too. But you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bow down and call us missus. Let us hang out the wash and wash the dishes. But when time came around to elect our president, they said, see you later, alligator, and don't forget my mashed potatoes, 'cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. Oh, we were suffering without suffrage. Not a woman could vote no matter what her age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we pull down on the levee. We cast our ballots and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Those pilgrim women who braved the boat, they cooked the turkey, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross, who sold the flag, was left behind on election day. Then Susan B. Anthony, Julia Howe, Lucretia Mott, they showed us how. They carried signs and marched in lines until their law was passed. Oh, we were suffering without suffrage. Not a woman could vote no matter what her age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we pull down on the levee. We cast our ballots and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Ooh, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Right on, sisters, right on! Oh, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. There were during the suffrage movement, there were lots of journals published, suffrage journals, and they carried articles, of course, on suffrage, but also they carried articles on many other topics. They carried articles on the issues raised by the resolutions passed at the Seneca Falls Convention. They also carried articles on the growing number of women working in the growing trade union movement, and on sexual discrimination at work, and on sexual harassment at work. They carried articles on the growing understanding of the sexual oppression of women, and on prostitution, and on the sexual double standard. And of course, during the women's liberation movement, and today, women are discussing many of the same issues. In 1973, the women's liberation movement, and all of us really, won a great victory when the Supreme Court issued the Roe versus Wade ruling, which says that says, by the way, present tense, that abortion is constitutional and therefore legal, and thereby giving women some semblance of control over their reproductive capabilities, some semblance of choice over whether to go through with a pregnancy or not, by allowing a woman who wants to have an abortion to have a legal and therefore most likely safe and affordable abortion. An issue directly connected to abortion, of course, is the issue of contraception, birth control. You know, it wasn't officially legal in this country to use birth control until 1965. There were no federal laws regulating the issue, but states could, and 26 states did, have laws outlawing the use of birth control. you could go to jail if you got caught. Many people did go to jail for publicly advocating the use of birth control. In 1965, the Supreme Court issued a ruling prohibiting states from outlawing the use of birth control by married couples. In 1972, the Supreme Court issued a ruling prohibiting states from outlawing the use of birth control by unmarried couples. In 1960, the birth control pill had been introduced to the United States. And in 1972, Loretta Lynn and 3 Nashville songwriters wrote a song that Loretta Lynn recorded. And her record company held on to it. They didn't release it. They held on to it for 3 years, actually, because they knew how controversial it would be. And they were right. When it was released, it was banned on most country stations. It still went to number 5 on the country charts, although that was actually unusual for a Loretta Lynn song because they always went right to number 1 as soon as they were released. It did go to number 1 on the pop charts in Canada. Many sociologists and historians feel that this song was influential in creating a climate of acceptance in the United States for the use of prescription birth control. Loretta Lynn said in many interviews that she talked to lots of doctors, mainly in the rural South, who told her that this song did more to make women feel comfortable and not ashamed to use prescription birth control than any of the literature that they passed out at their clinics and offices.
Your wife, you'd show me the world. All I've seen of this old world is a bed and a doctor bill. I'm tearing down this brooder house cause now I've got the pill. All those years I stayed at home while you had all your fun. And every year that's gone by, another baby's come. There's gonna be some changes made right here on Nursery Hill. You set this chicken door last time cause now I've got the pill. This old maternity dress I've got is going in the garbage. The clothes I'm wearing from now on won't take up so much yardage. Mini skirts and hot pants with a few little fancy frills. I'm making up for all those years cause now I've got the pill. Comes easy now that I've got the pill. It's getting dark, it's roosting time, tonight's too good to be real. And Daddy, don't you worry none, cause Mama's got the pill. Daddy, don't you worry none, cause Mama's got the pill.
The most militant and most well-known suffrage movement was that which took place in England. Women from the United States who could afford to went over to England to participate in suffrage events, discussed strategy and tactics with suffrage activists and leaders. Ironically, women in England didn't win the right to vote until 8 years after women in the United States won the right to vote. The leading organization in the suffrage struggle in England was the Women's Social and Political Union, and that organization had as its motto, deeds not words. They carried out mass leafleting campaigns, national speaking tours, mass marches. They had in 1908 in Covent Garden in London a rally and march for suffrage of 250,000 people. They also carried out civil disobedience, probably because Parliament didn't listen to those 250,000 people. They staged sit-ins, they blocked traffic, they marched on Parliament, they started fires. They had mass window smashing campaigns in which they threw potatoes and rocks through the windows of all the members of Parliament who had spoken against or voted against suffrage. I kind of like that campaign. This song was written in 1910 and was the official song of the Women's Social and Political Union. It used as its lyrics a poem that had been written by Cecily Hamilton, who was an activist in the movement and was a professional writer. And the composer of the song was also an activist in the movement. Her name was Ethel Smith, and by profession she was a composer of classical music and a highly regarded composer of classical music. And as an aside, Ethel Smith wrote 3 operas, one of which, called Der Wald, had been, in 1903, was the first opera composed by a woman to be performed by the Metropolitan Opera Company of New York. And it remained the only opera composed by a woman, performed by the Met, for 113 years. This is Ethel Smith's The March of the Women. I have one more song I'm going to do for you, but I do want to thank you for watching, and I want to wish you safe and healthy times. I'm going to finish with a song that was an anthem of the women's liberation movement in the 1960s and 70s and is still widely sung today. In 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, January through middle of March, about 10 weeks, there was a great strike of textile workers, 20,000 workers, almost all women. The official leadership of the strike was the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, but the real leaders on the ground were women from the textile mills. They were striking for better wages, living wages really, and for better and safer working conditions. And they won most of their demands, although the bosses took back most of those victories over the next few years, but for the moment they won. And by the way, in the Lawrence strike, there were 40 different ethnic nationalities involved, and strike literature and information was translated and published and distributed to workers in 25 different languages. The strike was really the culmination of several strikes in the garment and textile workers industries. In New York City in 1909, there had been a garment workers strike called the Uprising of 20,000. In Chicago in 1910, the Great Chicago Garment Workers Strike, also called the Hart, Schaffner, and Marx Strike, had 41,000 workers go out on strike, again, mostly women. And the women who were the organizers and leaders and activists in these strikes were also, almost always, also organizers and activists and leaders in the suffrage movement. In Chicago in 1910, one of the primary organizers of the strike was a woman named Helen Todd. Her actual job was as a factory inspector for the state of Illinois. And that same year of 1910, she was on a speaking tour of Illinois, sponsored by a women's trade union organization, giving speeches in favor of women's suffrage. And in one of those speeches, she used the concept that women and workers need bread and roses. Bread for sustenance, roses for beauty, art, culture, love. And she wrote an article on how she got the idea for that speech, and the idea, by the way, came from the daughter of a family that she was staying with on that speaking tour, and the daughter said to her, "Yes, we want bread, but we want flowers too." And Helen Todd wrote an article about how she got the idea for that speech, and the article was published in several journals. And in 1911, an American writer named James Oppenheim read her article and wrote a poem based on the idea of bread and roses. And later, many people said that they saw in Lawrence, at the Lawrence strike, women and children carrying signs that said, "We want bread and we want roses too." And Lawrence has become known as the Bread and Roses Strike. Oppenheim's poem has been set to music many times. John Denver set it to music. The version that's sung in the women's liberation movement, the women's movement, and most widely sung, uses music by Mimi Farina, who was Joan Baez's sister and a fine singer, very fine singer in her own right. As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill walks gray are struck with all the radiance that a sodden sun discloses. For the people here are singing bread and roses, bread and roses. Go marching, marching, we battle too for men. And they are in the struggle, and together we will win. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until
give us roses. As we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing their ancient calls for bread. Smart and love and beauty, their trudging spirits move. Yes, it is bread we fight for, or we fight for roses too. As we go marching, marching, we're standing proud and tall. For the rising of the women is the rising of us all. No more the drudge and idle, and the toil while one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, wearing roses, wearing roses. As we go marching, marching, we're standing proud and tall. The rising of the women is the rising of us all. No more the drudge and idle, and the toil while one reposes, but a sharing of life's